recording started this afternoon. As people kind of start to file in, I'm going to share my screen so that we can kind of get started. Share, share, share. Let's see. Now see your application. Excellent. All right. Looks good. Yes. All right. So welcome everyone to our Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project webinar on immigrants, autism, and the importance of advocacy. Oh, sorry. My name is Dalton Byers. I am with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. I'm going to be the technical assistant today. If you have any issues with Zoom, or if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll enable chat soon, or maybe it already is. It is excellent. So I'll make sure that everyone can use that. There we go. So if you have questions, I'll be moderating that chat. But for reference, the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project, or ATA, develops and presents resources that assist individuals with autism in their transition from secondary to post-secondary or employment. And so today, this is an example of our more education-focused. ICSPS, or the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, has existed at Illinois State University since 1977, providing creating like professional development environments for equitable education and supporting many things, including universal design for learning. We want to thank our funder, the Illinois State Board of Education, and I'm going to have a couple different polls that I'm about to launch. 1 second. Polls. This first one is going to ask where you're at. I will pull it back up in just a moment. So each number kind of corresponds to a different area: Chicago, Northeast, Northwest, Central, Southwest, and Southeast. I know the M has brought in a lot of people from outside of the state, so if you've got other things, feel free just to drop statewide. That makes sense. And in addition, we also have our 6 primary audiences. So if you're part of the secondary school system, if you're yourself a young adult or a student, and if you're post-secondary, university, college, things like that, a community member, if you are families, if you're related to an individual with autism, or support that, and then employers. You may be in a lot of them, so kind of just fit what's right for you in this moment. But here's that kind of map again for those who are trying to see where you fit. Now let's give you all just a minute or so to finish up your responses. Looks like we've got a lot from Northern and Chicago area, with some from statewide and central. So that's excellent. And a lot from post-secondary and secondary educators. So that can again give you some reference M for the people that we are looking. But there's our results just for everybody. And I'm going to close the channel, stop sharing, and let M go ahead and take off. Stop.
Well, go ahead and share and get started. Let's
Okay.
see.
Oh,
Okay, here we
we do have
go.
someone raising their hand.
Okay.
Donna, I'll let you talk. Hello? If you have a question, you can drop in the chat, or I gave you speaking permissions for a moment. Oh, how about we? Okay, go ahead, Em.
Okay, cool. I'll go ahead and share. There we go. Um, can y'all see the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Let's go ahead and get into it then. So yeah, I'm gonna be presenting this webinar about, the immigrants, autism, the importance of advocacy. I'll talk a little bit about my positionality and stuff, but I'll go into it now. So let's start off with the table of contents. So again, first off, I'll be talking about my positionality, relevant to the content material and such. I'm going to talk a little bit about our current context. I'm going to do my best to avoid political speech, but at the very least, give context for like the identity groups affected, how things are going right now. Then I'm going to talk about experiences, both stuff that I've found personally and in my research. And then we're going to talk a little bit about advocacy and the ways that manifests and who it can manifest from. Um, then we're going to go into strategies for educators, for students, which is going to include some information about college preparedness since I work in university accommodations. And then also regarding ESL students, ESL learners. And then I'm going to share resources both for autism and immigrant communities, just so that you have stuff that you can use to, like serve students of that background or like better understand students of that background, that kind of thing. And also support the families. And then I'm gonna have some takeaways, just the basic stuff that should probably be taken away from this presentation once we're done with this. And then I'll provide time for Q&A. I would like to save questions for the end, but feel free to put them in the chat. You can also just write them down somewhere, like put them in a notepad online or something so that you can copy paste them later. Totally up to you. What I will say is that I won't be answering questions until the end. So that's how it's gonna be formatted. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. So yeah, so first off, I just do want to specify I'm going to be using identity first language, which referring to like for example, I would say that I am an autistic person, not a person with autism. It's very much case by case for individuals, but I've found that a lot of the time in the neurodivergent community especially, there's this understanding of like autism is a very impactful thing, and it's identity first works better for this kind of context, even though a lot of the time people will prefer to use person first language of disability, which is totally reasonable. And again, it's very case by case, but personally, I will be using identity first language in reference to autism in this presentation. Also for context, I'm probably going to be fidgeting a little bit, maybe rocking around. I have a little fidget toy. I'm going to try to be quiet with it, but like, due to my autism, I wanted to contextualize that I might be fidgeting a little bit. But yeah, to start off with, I am a second generation American, Japanese American on my mother's side. My mother is the first one in her family to come to the United States. I was diagnosed with autism in 2015 at age 14. So that's relatively young for a non-male person of color or just a person of color in general. Um, I work at the Disability Resource Center at Portland State University as an access counselor consultant. That means I work directly with college students to get them accommodations. So that can include like not just getting them accommodations, but getting them the supports they need in terms of like what other offices they might need to contact, how else we can support them, where else they might need to go for their resources and stuff. We're kind of like a central support for students with disabilities on campus. And then I work a lot with students of immigrant and international backgrounds. I'm not necessarily sure how much of that is that Portland State is a very diverse institution, which it is pretty diverse for the area, and how much of it is just that I am coming from a background of having like a visibly non-Anglo name. That could also be impactful. But either way, I work a lot with students of immigrant and international backgrounds. I've also been a witness to immigrant parental disability advocacy since junior high. I'll talk a little bit about that in my experiences. But that is something that I've been seeing from, like from my mother, my immigrant parent, since I was very young. So yeah, let's get into the current context. I will say again, not getting into the specifics of it, but it's not the safest time ever for immigrants in the United States currently, and I just really want to encourage just kindness and support and communication. One of the things is patients with immigrant families. Cultural barriers can be really hard to communicate through, but ultimately it's important to do so. Engaging in cultural humility, making cultural humility is in like being aware of like, your culture isn't the end all be all, and supporting, the needs of students based on their cultural backgrounds and stuff, as well as working with their families. Accepting language barriers is one of many facets of communication and interaction. What I will say is that some people are coming from a background where they like their parents. Some students might speak English, but their parents don't. Some students might be English as a second language, and their parents are as well. So there's a lot of different ways that language impacts communication. But just, like provide time for people to like sort of think things through, especially if they're coming from a point where English is not their first language when they're having communication with you in English. And at the very least, I expect that everyone in this room knows to do so, but I would say basic decency and kindness to all immigrants you interact with in and out of work is incredibly important. This is true for all people, but I've noticed that sometimes immigrants don't get the same treatment as Americans when it comes to that basic decency and kindness. So I ask you all to be mindful of that kind of thing when engaging with people of various backgrounds within your day to day. So yeah, let's get into the presentation. One of the things I found via research is that there are immigrant parents who consider autism as a Western disease. This is something I've colloquially seen in Asian communities, Asian immigrant communities and Asian diasporas, but it's also something I found the research primarily in the Somali diaspora. A lot of parents within that, when their children get diagnosed in like the Western country they've immigrated to, whether that be like America, Canada, whatever, they will end up thinking like, oh, this wouldn't have been a thing if we had stayed in Somalia, or whatever country of origin. This is a Western disease. This is something made up within the West as a way to pathologize my child, that kind of thing. So it can be kind of like a sort of negative cultural attitude there. Latino parents that I found in the research report that there's a lot of disability stigma within their personal, like, communities as Latinos. There's also not a lot of information in terms of health literacy and jargon, and healthcare barriers, both financially and within that context of like informational barriers, are reasons for a delayed or non-existent diagnosis for their children. There's a study of Iranian and Afghani fathers. Many wanted there to be more cultural and linguistic support. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. But cultural and linguistic support doesn't really necessarily come naturally to those who are on the spectrum of immigrant backgrounds. For example, one of my social mannerisms, I still bow most days when talking to my elders. That is because I come from a Japanese background. I didn't fully realize that that wasn't a thing in America, so most of my teachers just thought I was really polite in grade school. So that's something that I would say, or in K through 12. So I would just say that that is something to keep in mind. That cultural linguistic differences can really impact those who are coming from like multiple cultures and are on the spectrum, especially. So yeah, let's see. The most common threads that I found in the research is that the barriers tend to be a distrust of American healthcare, for both valid and less valid reasons, but still, like coming from a point of not really necessarily trusting the ways that American healthcare works. Lacking access to healthcare, whether that be financially or because of health literacy, like I mentioned, with jargon and how that can be really confusing to those who speak English as a second language. Ableist understandings of autism from home cultures can be really a factor, or like just like not understanding autism in general because of it not being discussed in the home cultures. That can be really impactful. And also, frankly, there are racist, like mental health or like health professionals in general. Like I don't like that that's true, but that is to some extent true. And a lot of the time that can impact people who are coming from backgrounds as like people of color, for example, or immigrant backgrounds, and or immigrant backgrounds. Like for example, there's a belief that autism is inherently more likely in white males. It's pretty pretty established that most of the autism diagnosis research pretty early on was rooted in white boys specifically. I actually used to joke that I had white boy autism because I was diagnosed pretty remarkably young for an AFAB person of color. But there is not necessarily like the same kind of experiences experienced by like children of color or immigrant children with autism as well as women with autism or girls with autism. So that's why I emphasize that there is that like cultural element that can be impactful to diagnosis both ways. But yeah, as for my personal experiences, as again the child of a Japanese immigrant, my mom was always very deeply loving and compassionate, but she didn't really come into America with an understanding of autism. My dad, who's on the spectrum, he also very caring, but he didn't really sufficiently communicate the genetic component to my mom. We already knew that I had cousins diagnosed with autism, and my dad was kind of aware that he was on the spectrum. But it wasn't necessarily something that was openly discussed, and therefore it was harder for me to get diagnosed at a certain point. Um, Also, I will say in Japan, autism is not really discussed, not really understood. And it's also tougher to handle because the culture is so high context. High context in this context refers to a culture where things aren't explained explicitly. So that can be really challenging for those with autism in the sense that they might not understand how they're supposed to behave because there's a lot of implicit social rules as opposed to explicit. If you want to better understand that from a Japanese perspective, a really good example is the book Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. Convenience Store Woman is a book that is, while not explicitly about an autistic woman's experience, I will say, as someone who has read it and has listened to several other autistic people, particularly autistic people of color, mention it, it is very much about an autistic Japanese woman's experience. And it has a lot of insight on how that culture can kind of impact her there. But yeah, and then with my mom not necessarily being notified of these symptoms that I mentioned in my autism, I wasn't diagnosed until I needed academic accommodations. I was doing really bad in school by like junior high. I had a lot of different times where I've really not been a great student. And when it comes to like doing poorly, that was why I got my academic accommodations. And then when it comes to some good news on that matter, my mom was able to get a master's in psychology around around the time of my diagnosis. And she has always been caring, but she became a really devoted ally when it came to supporting me as an autistic individual um, since starting and completing a program. And that was the point where her compassion that already existed was synthesized with extra knowledge about the psychology of autism, and how that might impact, like a growing teenager like I was at the time. So that was really, really supportive and helpful. But yeah, I think that synthesis of compassion and knowledge is really important to recognize when it comes to growth for autistic students and such. Let's see. Okay, when it comes to advocacy, there's a few different kinds. What I will say is that parental advocacy is not always guaranteed when it comes to foreign-born parents. It essentially depends on, again, the attitudes towards autism and autism awareness in the country of origin. Even so, regardless of maybe not necessarily having the most like cultural information when it comes to their home culture, they can be the most important ally to the student at times. I've met plenty of, including my mother, but also others, plenty of immigrant parents who are so willing to stand up for their child, who is on the spectrum. And that can be super important in the process of getting students accommodations, especially when working with people who may be less culturally informed and may not be able to tell how autism can impact those who are of immigrant backgrounds and such. Um, Educator advocacy is limited. I'm saying this as an educator. As educators, we're not qualified to diagnose, so we can't like be like, hey, your child has autism. Like that's not a thing. But we can assist in communicating with parents. If there's a student who's like struggling in school, encouraging parents to look into like learning supports and like other kinds of maybe not necessarily using the phrasing of disability or autism, but at least being like, hey, have you gotten your child evaluated for learning challenges, that kind of thing, if the child is experiencing those challenges in classes. But it also requires some cultural humility. I would say that when it comes to that, understand that a lot of these parents might not be coming at it from an understanding of autism that's the same as someone who had gotten like an American education in like whatever understanding of autism they might have had from that point. But yeah, and then when it comes to student self-advocacy, that is incredibly important to foster prior to higher education. It can assist in later needs. to like have that kind of that kind of support and self-advocacy skill, especially when it comes to getting collegiate accommodations and establishing ADA workplace accommodations. So regardless of whether they're going to college first or if they're going straight into the career field, having that self-advocacy knowledge is vital to making sure that there is that kind of support and understanding within the student there. And again, like I mentioned, it's necessary to maintain collegiate accommodations. What I will say, some parents do come into their first, to their student's first accommodation appointment. That is relatively normal. Some people do it, some people don't. But what I will say is that parents can't be there for every single time the student might need an accommodation appointment or an appointment with their disability counselor. So I would just say to be aware of how self-advocacy is built within the student prior to higher education, because otherwise it can be really challenging to catch up when they get to college and they realize they might need accommodations. Um, we're gonna get into some strategies now. This is generally for educators. This is going to be about universal design. So, for students who can't or otherwise don't yet have access to diagnosis, universal design principles are incredibly useful in making sure that you have an accessible classroom for both those who are diagnosed or supported and those who have less built-in supports and diagnosis and such. Um, what this can include is allowing stuff like headphones, fidgets, other sensory regulators. During solo work time, quiet fidgets and sensory regulators could also be used during like lectures, for example, or like presentations and such. Just having something quiet they can fidget with can really help with like centering the attention needed for neurodivergent, especially autistic students. Um, what I'll also say is that when it comes to laying out the routines for class, you want to lay them out as clearly as possible. Same with your course materials and stick with them. One thing that I've heard as a challenge for a lot of students on the spectrum is just not necessarily having like having conflicting course materials can be really confusing for them. For example, maybe you had like a syllabus from like 2024 or something that had like slightly outdated information that told you how to do an assignment slightly wrong, and then the assignment information says like this is how you do it. But if neither of them are dated, then you don't end up like the student doesn't know which way to go. So you want to make sure your course materials are laid out as clearly as possible, along with the routines for class, and just sticking with how they are structured. I would also say to consider multimodal support when it comes to encouraging different kinds of learning. Um, not only with the visual and auditory and like hands-on kind of examples of learning, what I'll also say is that sometimes neurodivergent students, especially students who are coming from an English as a second language background and or are on the spectrum, might be too shy to speak in front of class. So I would say that some things that can help with that are not calling on students unless their hands are raised, if that's an option, as well as including written input. So that can be like they've got these sites like Menti and other things like that, where you can have students submit their written thoughts using their like school laptops or whatever. And they can essentially just share what they're thinking either anonymously or they can still credit it, but they don't have to like speak in front of the class, which can be again really challenging for those with communication related issues rooted in autism and or ESL learning. So yeah. Let's see. When it comes to student advocacy and building that, um, I do want to say that including students in this like 504 plan or IEP accommodation process is really important for developing their self-advocacy skills because they are probably going to have to self-advocate at some point in university, if not the very start, definitely throughout it. And it can really help in that sense. What I will say is also students from immigrant backgrounds, from what I've seen as someone who works with a lot of students from immigrant backgrounds who are in higher ed, they often come into the unsure of like what they need and how to advocate for themselves. They're really like kind of struggling, and I've noticed sometimes they'll even come in kind of late, like they'll come in like halfway through a term and be like, hey, I need accommodations now, and they won't know what to do, they won't know how to advocate for themselves, they won't know what to ask for. So it's really important to develop these self-advocacy skills as early as possible. What I will say is internalized pressure from cultural backgrounds can absolutely come into play when it comes to this. For example, anecdotally, I've heard from higher ed staff working with primarily Asian American students that the model minority stereotype often causes students of that background to neglect the idea that they might need accommodations, even if they know that they're struggling, because they think like I'm supposed to be good at this, I'm supposed to be capable, I'm supposed to be this, that, or the other, and they might not necessarily realize that they need support, and they think that like support would be like crutches, which slightly ableist terminology, but like like essentially coming from a point where they don't feel like they need support even if they absolutely would need support to continue being a student effectively. The inverse can also be that students who are minoritized or immigrant students from like non-model minority backgrounds might have challenges pursuing accommodations because they either might not feel like school is worth it because they've been so marginalized for how they've learned for the longest time, or they want to prove themselves as being capable of how to accommodations. That's an attitude I've often seen in a lot of students with immigrant backgrounds. Um, so yeah, when it comes to college preparedness, I would say to consider, like for what students should consider, if their background is like, of an immigrant family, marginalized, whatever, if they're not able to get a diagnosis due to their background or whatever other factors, you'd want to encourage them to try to pursue it if they suspect they have it as an adult. Or frankly, they should be honest with their college disability counselor. What I will say is that it really depends on the school how much we can do without documentation. For example, my university, we do want documentation, but occasionally, depending on the factors and severity, we could start the process with like some minor temporary accommodations until the student is able to get documentation or diagnosis. And for example, some of the documentation we take is like if a student might not have a diagnosis but as a therapist, we give them a supplemental documentation form where they can take it to their therapist and their therapist can outline their needs so that we get that kind of information of how to support them from a professional that works with them. But it isn't like gonna be completely a barrier just because it takes forever to get autism diagnoses as an adult, which from what I've heard is true. Um, when it comes to students who had diagnoses and therefore had an IEP or a 504 plan, they can think about like what worked for them in terms of what accommodations they had and what didn't work for them. That's actually a really good place to start. I often tell students when they're coming straight from high school, like, hey, do you have an IEP or 504? If so, please share it with me because then I can get some of these accommodations that you had then and try to find equivalent versions here so that you can get the support that you need there. They can also think about like what didn't. What I will say is that an important note is that the difference between K through 12 and higher ed accommodations is that K through 12 accommodations are supposed to be something that spurs success. They are supposed to make it so that students can succeed in school. In higher education, it's different. We are expected to provide access, not success. So students still have to be the ones to push themselves to succeed. We just, so to speak, supply the gas for the car to move, that kind of thing. So we make sure that they have the access to do what they need to succeed. Um, Otherwise, if they didn't have a 504 plan, you can encourage them to think about the support that could have helped if they, like, for whatever challenges they might have had during school. For example, if they were constantly running out of test time, they could think about that and be like, oh, I might need, testing accommodations when I get to college, that kind of thing. And just to think about the academic challenges that they face, it helps to help them outline it. Maybe like encourage them to get out a Google Doc or a sheet of paper and just kind of write down what they've been challenged with. And then that way they have kind of an outline of stuff to discuss with their disability services coordinator when it comes to higher education. Let's see. So next I wanted to share this pretty helpful acronym. It's called I-Plan. So it starts with I, inventory your needs, goals, strengths, and choices. That was that outline thing I was talking about earlier. I would also say, when it comes to that, they can also like talk. This is kind of more angled towards the IEP 504 involvement for students, but this can also apply to college, collegiate stuff. I would say that emphasizing their specific needs is really important in a collegiate context, whereas goal-oriented work, may work better within the K through 12 context. Providing the inventory, again, that's just sharing the outline that we talked about. And then the last three, but especially this next one, but the last three in general are really especially important for ESL students. For L, it is listen carefully and respond thoughtfully. This can be something where it's like if you're not only working on socially moderating yourself by masking as an autistic individual, but also coming from a point where you are trying to translate what you want to say, it can take them a while. I would say open up space for them to talk. If there's constantly people talking over them, they won't feel like they can get a word in edgewise. So I would just say encourage them to listen, but also encourage them like, hey, if you're trying to think about what you want to say, we'll give you some time to think on it. That kind of thing can be really helpful for making students aware that they have time and capability to advocate for themselves regardless of their background. Also encouraging them to ask questions. Maybe like again, this can be tough for neurodivergent educators, but if they look confused, maybe be like, "Hey, do you have any questions about this process? Do you have any questions about this thing that we're doing?" That way they can feel ready and capable of asking what they need to do, or what they need to know to better understand the process for themselves. Um, I'd also say they should name their goals clearly. That's again like kind of part of the K through 12 process, but naming their needs in this case would be more appropriate for collegiate accommodations. And just stating what they're challenged with and what they feel they would need support on can be really helpful for like getting better accommodations and getting the accommodations that will best serve them. Um, let's see. So when it comes to ESL students, I will say that when it comes to sensory processing issues that are pretty common with autism, that can make it hard for them to parse audio. And so you should try to include captions. For audio/video, including captions will not only enable students with sensory processing related issues, but it can also make it easier for deaf and hard of hearing students. So again, it's that universal design element of making sure that students feel included regardless of their capacity for various things, whether that be listening, whether that be reading, whether that be whatever. Um, what I will also say is that given the intersection of autism and ESL, public speaking can be painful and even somewhat traumatic as an experience for those with speech and anxiety related symptoms that can really inhibit learning for students, for ESL students with autism. They might feel, like you need to balance challenge and support. If you're doing too much challenge, they'll feel like they can't go anywhere with it. So just making sure that you're finding opportunities for them to practice speaking without maybe speaking in front of the whole class. For example, recorded video assignments. That way they don't feel the pressure of everyone staring at them at once, but they're still speaking and practicing that speaking element. What I will say is that also it's important to teach the social skills and norms of the local culture as well as language. So not only language, but those cultural elements. It might not be apparent to those who only have firsthand experience in American culture, and no other like cultures that they're directly related to. But country by country, social norms vary so much. And a lot of the time they require research by or explanation to autistic individuals for them to adapt. Not every autistic individual is going to know what to research or how to research social norms for their country that they've ended up in. And so the local culture is really important to just teach and facilitate that kind of growth and adaptation within ESL students on the spectrum. So yeah, we're gonna get into resources now. What I want to say about these resources, I've kind of divvied them up into autism-related resources and immigration-related resources, or immigrant community-related resources. What I will say is that just try to synthesize these in some sense. A lot of the time, this information is going to be somewhat more about autism or somewhat more about immigrant and or ESL backgrounds, but at the very least, having that kind of ability to synthesize and get a more holistic understanding is going to be really helpful for combining these researches that I found. Um, let's see. So when it comes to autism-related resources, I'm going to recommend the College Autism Network. They did a really important documentary that I think you can find on Canopy called Autism Goes to College, which is a really good insight on autistic students becoming college students and how that changes, things for them and how they're able to adapt to it. Um, and I'm gonna try to get these links shared out somehow after it. I'm gonna touch base with Dalton just to see how we can share this out, whether that be sharing the presentation or sharing the links. But yeah, and then there's links on educator resources. They're mostly free. I would encourage you to look through ones first. That's what I did, but there might also be some valuable information in some of the other resources, which I didn't think were too expensive. But either way, the Organization for Autism Research had some information that teachers can benefit from in that sense. There's a site called Autism Spectrum Teacher that I found. It's resources specifically from a neurodivergent educator. I want to emphasize that when it comes to working with autistic students and with neurodivergent students, it's important not only to listen to those students, but to your neurodivergent peers and colleagues. If you know that you have like neurodivergent peers and colleagues, and they're giving you input, obviously, people shouldn't have to be the end all be all to explain themselves to, as the marginalized people to everyone else. But what I will say is that neurodivergent people might have a breadth of information that you might not be as privy to. So working with your colleagues who are neurodivergent can be really helpful in order to make sure that you're supporting your neurodivergent students as well. Um, Autism Internet modules and Iris Center module are both like training modules when it comes to better understanding how to work with autism as an educator, and they can be really insightful and resourceful in that sense. Another thing I want to mention with the Autism Self-Advocacy Network is that, so I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Autism Speaks. I will not go into why. I would suggest you do your own research. I don't like Autism Speaks. I do think that they have a lot of problems with their ideology and how they go about discussing autism. My alternative that I suggest to people is the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. They are an organization that is created by autistic individuals for both autistic individuals and educating allies to autistic individuals. They can be really helpful. They're much more centered on finding ways to work within autism as opposed to trying to find a cure or trying to get rid of autism in some way, which is much more of Autism Speaks ideology. I would also say we talked about it earlier, Dalton mentioned it, but be sure to check out the organizers' webinar, the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project through the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. They are super duper helpful when it comes to like collegiate and career preparedness for autistic individuals. And again, they like all the categories that Dalton mentioned at the start, they serve a lot of different groups and demographics that could really benefit from more autism-related knowledge. So I would just say to look into what they've got, so to speak. But yeah, when it comes to immigrant and family resources, I wanted to share a helpline that is important to share. It's for immigrants in need of legal assistance. I think we can kind of surmise what legal assistance might be needed in these certain cases. But also the National Immigration Services Legal Directory, as well as the National Immigrant Justice Center are legal resources for immigrant families as needed. And then the Immigrant Learning Center's resources for teachers is incredibly helpful for educators to better understand the ways to support and serve students of immigrant families when it comes to just making sure that there's that there's understanding there and that there's that cultural humility and acceptance there. And utilizing cultural relativism when it comes to teaching to students of those immigrant backgrounds. The next thing I'm going to share, it's a little heavy, but I want people to know about it. It's just some resources, both in English and Spanish, about what to do if ICE agents show up. This is something you can share. You could take pictures of this. You could screenshot it. You can also just get it from the ACLU website. But this is a sort of know your rights slip, so that those who are coming from these backgrounds where they may be marginalized in by immigration enforcement, they can get that kind of support they might need when it comes to just like knowing what to do and knowing how to go. And so like maybe just having like a couple printouts available in your office, that kind of thing, can be helpful just for like making sure that there's that understanding and support ready for people of those backgrounds. But yeah, to get into the takeaways, we're towards the end now. Um, I will say that autistic students of immigrant backgrounds often need specialized support that differ from neurotypical and or exclusively American peers. And when I say that, that refers to not only autistic students of immigrant backgrounds needing more support, special no, not more support, but more specialized support than neurotypical and American peers, like people who are both neurotypical and American, but also compared to their neurotypical immigrant peers or their neurodivergent American peers. They are going to need that kind of holistic centered support where it's going to be a combination of that, autistic student support as well as immigrant student support. And so, I would just say to be aware of that intersectionality there and how you can support intersectionality there, which goes great into universal design, which is going to open up doors for all. It's kind of like, for example, like if you're able to pave off like when it snows, if you're able to pave off the road, the part of the road that's like a ramp as opposed to stairs, everyone can use the ramp. But if you only pave off the stairs, only able-bodied people are going to be able to get up. So it's important to just consider universal design as a factor for how to include students of all backgrounds. It's just generally good practice. I would encourage research into that more so. Um, Educators in the ways they can support like autistic and immigrant background students is just enhancing communication accessibility. Again, that plays into universal design. Having clear, consistent, and accessibly worded communication can go a long, long, long way in making sure that there is the support needed for students who are coming from these backgrounds and different experiences and different understandings of English and how they work with education. For students who want to pursue college, or frankly, even if they're just going straight into a career, creating a space for that self-advocacy during their accommodations process in K through 12 is absolutely very important, as it can really help them build up the skills they need to become an independent, successful autistic adult. As I'm speaking as an independent, relatively successful autistic adult. But yeah, so that's it for the takeaways. I am going to go ahead and open up to Q&A time now. So if there is anything anyone wants to share, I think Dalton's going to start reading questions for me. But then also, if you'd like to contact me, if you think of questions afterwards or otherwise need to reach out, my email's right there. That is my work email. And then also, I wanted to share my LinkedIn. So that's my LinkedIn link. Feel free to just look it up, find it, and then you can communicate with me there if you'd like to.
Excellent. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Em. This was a
Yeah.
very, I think, very informative, very insightful, both from your personal experience and well researched. And so I'm blown away. I
Thank you
loved
so
it.
much, Dalton. I really appreciate
Um,
it.
yeah, I wanted to offer just a couple comments in kind of reference to here. First, you discussed universal design for learning. I think an absolute amazing principle to be taken away from this. And you explained it very well. But if anyone is wanting to look into more resources on universal design for learning, I just dropped a link in the chat for ICSPS. We have an entire page dedicated with multiple videos and additional resources for universal design for learning, or UDL. So we're not the authors of it, but we have a lot of resources on it, and there are other places that you can look more into that. Someone did ask about like signing in. If you want a certificate of attendance or completion for attending this webinar, please email me. Let's do review, which I just dropped in the chat. Just saying I was at, and please specify what webinar you are attending, this webinar specifically, and I'll be able to get you a certificate within the next by mid of next week, hopefully sooner, but depending on how many, it could take me time. Um, and then finally, in that same time frame, you'll be able to find the recording of this webinar at the link I just dropped in chat as well. So there's all my little housekeeping things at the end. Um, so I am open up to anyone who has any specific questions for M or otherwise.
Should I go ahead and stop the screen share now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. I'll go ahead and stop that now. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so we've got one that just dropped in. Do you have any suggestions for how to approach conversations with families who may feel hesitant about screening or testing due to cultural stigma or concerns within some immigrant communities?
It does kind of depend on the culture of origin that we're talking about for the immigrant communities, but what I will say is that coming at it from a point of like it's as unpathologizing as possible. Like make it seem like it's a very normal thing because it is a normal thing for students to be on the spectrum. But a lot of the time people of these immigrant backgrounds don't always realize that coming in. And so essentially having being like, hey, we have a lot of students with learning challenges. Here's this center locally that helps our students with learning challenges to better understand their capabilities, their scope, and what they can do and how they can improve. Oftentimes, a lot of parents of those students, especially if those students are challenged or like struggling in school, they will probably feel pretty open to the idea of stuff that will help improve their child's academic abilities. And so framing it less as a get diagnosed for disability and more as a, hey, here's some learning support information so that your student can be the best student they can be, that kind of thing can be really helpful. Especially with a lot of these like more like a lot of the time, not to generalize, not to stereotype, but a lot of the time, parents from immigrant communities can be very like goals oriented when it comes to their students. So encouraging the process of learning disability assessment or whatever as more of a learning support than a disability assessment can be really helpful in that sense.
Absolutely, very good. I like that different framing can be super helpful for removing some of that stigma or at least addressing the stigma in a new light. One person asked, do you have any recommendations for literature or information to share with immigrant parents of autistic students who may not be as supportive of their students?
So I actually didn't have a whole lot of time to get specific books on the matter. What I will do is I'm going to share the sources utilized with Dalton when I share the presentation with him later. So I would recommend a lot of the articles I researched there. But what I will say is like I have some information on some books that I'm gonna pull up a book from my bookshop to actually recommend here. Um, this one is maybe less so for parents, but more for like students to better understand how like neurodivergency might impact them. I really recommend the book. It's not showing up. It's called Neuroqueer Heresies. And it's essentially it's an analysis of neurodivergency through queer theory by Dr. Nick Walker. She's a researcher who me and Dalton actually like learned about in our graduate program that we were both in. And that can be good for like student understanding. I'm sorry that I don't necessarily have too much for the parents right now, but I will look more into that, and see if I can share some resources to be shared out with the people who attended this presentation, after the fact. So I would love to share more, but I will say that the articles that I researched, when reading this are definitely going to be a good place to start with better, understanding like how to go about that communication.
Mhm. And in addition to that, we have resources on the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project specific for families. So I'm going to drop that link in the chat right here.
Awesome.
That includes even some just general information sheets. They are not contextualized for immigrant families necessarily, so that may be where
Mhm.
you become familiar with it, you share it with that family, and then you have a conversation over it, because then you'll be
Mhm.
able to maybe do some contextualizing because you have that relationship with them, hopefully. And so that could be at least a start. One person's asking, what does ASAN stand for? And I believe is that the
That is
autism.
the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. So that is, again, like an organization created by autistic individuals to support autism awareness in a more holistic sense. So the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. So I guess how you can remember it is like autism, the topic, self-advocacy, one of the also central topics, and then just network.
Very good. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone's asked in the chat, this is a me question. Will this be available? Yeah, the recording will be available as well as the presentation slides will be available. And in those slides, you will be able to follow any of those links to those resources. And also included like basically a bibliography of the research that they used in the presentation. And so that can, you can then kind of go through there and draw from there. Someone asked, you mentioned that autism is considered a Western diagnosis in some cultures. Are there specific ways that what we in the US call autism is conceptualized in other cultures?
It can vary. Also, hi, Abby. Abby's one of my coworkers. But one thing that I would say is that a lot of the time it's treated as something like not necessarily a diagnosis, but more as like a behavioral pattern within other cultures. For example, this is kind of again, this may be more in the pathologized sense, but less so like in the autism sense and more just like in a medical sense. For example, in Japan. Oftentimes someone who is awkward or socializing is called komusho, which is like communication. Shol and shol means like disease essentially, which is again kind of pathologizing. But that's like how it's that can be how it's understood sometimes, where someone who is on the spectrum might be called komusho, in the sense that they might just have trouble communicating, and that's the idea. So people might say that they have trouble communicating, or they might say like, oh, they're like super interested in this. Like they'll report it by symptoms more so than by diagnosis is an often thing. So they'll be like, oh, my child's not autistic. They just really like frogs and they also don't really talk to people. Like just an example. I know that's kind of stereotypical, but that's just like an example of how some parents who aren't necessarily open to the idea of their children being autistic might describe some symptoms that are related that could be autistic symptoms.
Excellent. People, you can keep dropping questions, but while we wait for others, I'll ask one of mine. You kind of talk a lot of very even some really specific strategies, which I thought were really good. Were there any like educators in your either secondary or post-secondary experience that kind of utilized good resources or gave you good support, and like what did that look like as someone who's a part of this population?
Um, What I will say is that I think like not to toot my own horn, but accommodations counselors have been really helpful throughout like my like post-secondary education. Both in I didn't really get too many accommodations in grad school, but when it came to undergrad accommodations, which were absolutely necessary for me to complete undergrad, those were like my accommodations counselors in undergrad were really helpful. The people I worked with in my internship at Illinois State University's SAS, so their accommodations office, was also really helpful. Another thing I'll say about like my K through 12 experience is that I can't remember all the specific names, but the teachers who wouldn't see me as an issue they had to deal with. Because I feel like sometimes, especially like one of my guidance counselors actually, my mom had beef with kind of, because she always kind of saw this as like, oh, M should go to special ed, M should do this and that. Like, M should be put in a program where they are not going to have the same material succeed as everyone else is kind of what she was saying, even though she wasn't necessarily saying it like that. And so, I guess like it's important for educators in that kind of context. And the ones that I've worked with that have been the best have been the ones who have really seen me for my personhood, and wanted me to succeed as a person and not just get me off their plate as an autistic student they had to have a 504 meeting because of.
That's absolutely excellent. And I think I think that's also is close to that universal design for learning, that each person that's in your classroom is a full person. and not a task to be solved or a problem, to be kind of overcome,
Yeah.
but a person who's there to learn and to contribute to the learning community.
Hmm.
So that's, I think, very good.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. Well, a lot of praise. If you don't have the chat open,
I
a
saw the
lot.
chat. Thank you all
Okay.
so much. I really
Yeah.
appreciate everything that people are sharing. It's really touching to see that like the information I've shared has been really positive.
Absolutely. I think it's a very
Thank
good
you all.
webinar.
Thank
And
you.
so I think we can kind of call it wraps there. Yep, everyone's loving it. So, again, if you would like a certificate of completion, please email me. I'll drop that again in the chat. Um, edu. And I can get that back to you hopefully in the next few days. And the webinar will be posted in a similar amount of time. So, but again, thank you, Em, and we will call it there.
Thank you all so much. Y'all have a nice day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.